They bulldozed the oak tree where my wife's ashes were buried. That's when I stopped asking for fairness. My HOA built 38 cabins on my private shoreline, and their president just laughed when I showed her the original deed, calling me a bystander on my own land. She waved her fake permits, smug, thinking she had all the power. But while she was busy building her little empire, she had no idea it was all sitting on a single, critical lie, and I was about to find the one piece of paper that proved I own every single cabin. Where are you watching from? Comment it below, because this is about to get biblical. And if you believe that a man's home is his castle and no HOA has the right to tear it down, hit subscribe so you don't miss them getting a taste of real justice. The best part of my day used to be the first 10 minutes. I'd take my coffee out to the back porch, same mug every morning, and just sit. The sun would be coming up over Mallory Lake, turning the water from gray to gold. It was quiet, except for the birds. A big oak tree stands down by the shore, older than my house, older than me. My wife, Sarah, her ashes are under that tree. We picked the spot together, years ago. She'd said, "When I'm gone, Jack, just let me watch the sunrises with you." So I did. For 12 years, that porch, that tree, that lake, it was our church. It was the only piece of peace we ever managed to build that the world couldn't touch, or so I thought. The new housing development next door, Lakeside Meadows, had a new HOA president, Carol Finch. I'd seen her around, always with a clipboard, always pointing at something someone was doing wrong. One morning, the sound wasn't birds. It was the beep 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 of a truck backing up, followed by the clank of metal. I stepped onto the porch, and my coffee went cold in my hand. Bright pink survey stakes were hammered into the ground all along my shoreline, running right past the old oak. I walked down there, still in my slippers. A man in a hard hat was unrolling a set of blueprints on the hood of his pickup. He didn't look up until I was right beside him. "Morning," I said. "Can I help you with something?" He grunted, pointing a thick finger at the plans. "HOA beautification project," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. 38 rental cabins, going up right here. He gestured toward my shoreline, a sweep of his arm that took in the oak tree and the patch of grass where Sarah and I used to have picnics. 38 cabins. The words didn't even make sense. This was Mallory Lake. My grandfather bought the parcel 60 years ago. It's been in the family ever since. I tried to explain this to the foreman, keeping my voice steady. He just shrugged. "Talk to the HOA, buddy. It's all approved. I just build what they tell me to build." So I went to the community meeting that night. The clubhouse smelled like air freshener and weak coffee. Carol Finch was at the front, pointing at a map on an easel. She had that perfectly styled hair that doesn't move, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When I raised my hand to speak, she looked right through me. I stood up anyway. I said my name, explained that the shoreline they were building on was my private property. She just kept smiling that plastic smile. She held up a thick folder. "We have all the necessary permits, sir. The county has approved our expansion. This is HOA land." She turned back to the crowd. "Mr. Mallory is a bystander here. This project is for the good of the community. A bystander. On my own land." I felt the eyes of my neighbors on me, some sympathetic, but most just wanting me to sit down so they could get back to arguing about lawn ornaments. The next day, I took my deed down to the construction site. It was folded and worn, the paper soft as cloth. I found Carol standing there, directing a man on a small bulldozer. I walked up and held it, out for her to see. "This is the original warranty deed, ma'am," I told her. "It shows my property line extends to the water's edge. This is my land." She didn't even glance at it. She actually laughed, a short, sharp sound like a barking dog. "Oh, that's cute," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "That's old zoning, Mr. Mallory. Things have been updated. The county filed a boundary adjustment decades ago. You're lucky we're letting you keep your dock." She turned her back on me, clipboard in hand, and started telling the bulldozer operator to clear the brush away from the oak. My Sarah's tree. For a second, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the world had tilted sideways. All the fairness I'd ever believed in, all the rules I'd lived by my entire life, they just evaporated in the face of this woman's smug confidence. I had been a soldier, an electrician. I believed in orders, in blueprints, in things that made sense. This made no sense. This was theft with a smile. I stood there for a long time, watching them work, feeling useless. I watched them clear the wildflowers Sarah had planted. I watched them pound stakes into the earth, just feet from the tree. Then I heard a sound that broke something deep inside me. It was a loud crack, followed by the grinding groan of the bulldozer's engine under strain. The blade had bitten too deep, caught on something thick. It ripped through the soil, tearing up a root as thick as my arm, a root from the oak tree, her tree. They were tearing her final resting place apart for a bunch of weekend rental cabins. The foreman yelled at the operator to back off, but the damage was done. The wound in the earth was ugly and raw. I looked over at Carol. She was busy on her phone, not even paying attention. My hands had started to shake, but it wasn't from fear. It was something else. Something cold and hard and quiet was settling in my chest, replacing the hurt and confusion. I turned and walked back to my porch, the useless deed still clutched in my hand. The whole world had gone quiet. All I could see was that torn root, that gash in the ground over my wife. That was the moment I stopped asking for fairness and started preparing for justice. Anger is a fire. It burns hot and fast, and then it's gone, leaving nothing but ash. What I felt wasn't anger. It was more like the cold, hard hum of a transformer right before it blows. My first move wasn't to yell or threaten. It was to verify. An electrician doesn't guess which wire is live. He tests it. So the next morning, I drove down to the county records office. It's a sad, beige building that smells like old paper and disappointment. I half expected to find out it was all a big mistake, a typo on a map that could be fixed with a pen and a signature. The clerk behind the counter was a woman who looked like she'd been worn smooth by decades of other people's problems. I gave her my parcel number and explained the situation. She typed for a few minutes, her screen reflecting in her glasses. Then she swiveled it around to face me. "Right here," she said, tapping a highlighted section. "Boundary adjustment, filed 1988. It rezoned that shoreline strip as communal access for the Lakeside Meadows development." She pointed to a set of coordinates. "According to this, the HOA's claim is valid. The land technically belongs to them." Technically. The word hung in the air. I looked closer at the digital map on her screen. I've been fishing that lake my whole life. I know every curve, every inlet. The coordinates she was pointing to didn't line up. They showed a straight line, but the shoreline curves like a crescent moon. "That's not right," I said quietly. "The lake doesn't run in a straight line there." She just shrugged. The universal gesture for, "Not my problem. The computer says what it says, sir. It's in the system." I walked out of that building feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. For a moment, I actually considered that Carol was right. Maybe I was just some old fool clinging to a piece of paper that didn't mean anything anymore. But an old fool knows when a tool isn't working right. The map was wrong. I needed my own set of tools, my own expert. I knew a kid, Luis Ortega. He'd done a tour in Afghanistan, came back and used his GI Bill to become a surveyor. Sharp as a tack, and he understood what it meant to have someone's back. I found him mapping a new commercial lot on the other side of town. I told him the story. He just listened, nodding, his eyes tracing the imaginary lines of my property in the air. He didn't question me. He just said, "When do you want me to start, Jack?" 2 days later, Luis was out there with his equipment. He didn't use old maps. He used GPS, satellites, things that deal in facts, down to the centimeter. While he worked, Carol Finch was busy, cementing her victory. Huge signs went up, dark green with white lettering. "Private HOA property. No trespassing. Violators will be prosecuted." They were positioned so I could see one perfectly from my kitchen window. Then the letter came. A certified envelope with the Lakeside Meadows logo. Inside was a formal notice, fining me $2,000 for interference with an approved community project. They were charging me for trying to protect my own land. That's when my neighbors started to change. Bill Hanley, who I'd shared beers with on his porch for 30 years, suddenly couldn't meet my eye. He'd just give a little half wave and hurry inside. Others would cross the street to avoid walking past my house. A couple of folks whispered their support when they thought no one was looking, but most were scared. Carol had made an example of me, and the message was clear: stay in line, or you're next. I was an island. A few days later, Luis called me. "You're not going to believe this, Jack," he said. "The county's map is based on a survey from the 70s. The GPS markers for your property line are exactly where your deed says they are. The HOA's boundary adjustment? The coordinates they filed in '88 are for the other side of your property, along the main road, not the lake." He'd found it. The clerical error. They'd either filed the wrong numbers by mistake, or filed them on purpose, banking on no one ever double-checking. But it didn't matter. With their signs up and a fine against my name, my word against theirs was nothing. I was feeling lower than a snake's belly in a wagon rut. I went up to the attic to look for some old tax returns, thinking about the lawyer fees this was going to cost me. The attic was hot and stuffy, filled with ghosts and forgotten boxes. Tucked away in a corner, under a dusty canvas tarp, was a heavy-duty file box I hadn't seen in years. The label on the side was written in my father's perfect block lettering: Mallory Estate Transfer, 1993. It was the box, with all the final paperwork from when my father passed, and the property legally became mine and Sarah's. My heart started to beat a little faster. I pulled it out, blew off a thick layer of dust, and popped the lid. Inside, beneath old insurance forms and probate documents, was a thick, pristine folder, and inside that folder was the original warranty deed from the full estate transfer. It wasn't the worn, folded copy I'd been carrying. This was the master document, stamped and sealed by the county itself. And as I read the legal description, my eyes landed on a phrase I had long forgotten. It didn't just say, my parcel included the land up to the water's edge. It specified my ownership, included the entire shoreline, literal rights, and, here was the killer, all submerged land up to the original geographic center line of the lake. I didn't just own the bank. I owned the ground the water sat on. I owned the lakebed they were drilling foundations into. They hadn't just trespassed on my lawn. They had built 38 cabins on land I owned outright, top to bottom. I sat there in the dusty heat of the attic, holding the paper that changed everything. They thought they'd buried me in paperwork. Turns out, they built their empire on my dirt. Finding that deed was like finding a key to a locked room you didn't even know existed. But my first instinct wasn't to kick the door in. An electrician knows you don't just flip the main breaker without checking the circuits first. One wrong move, and you blow the whole system. So, I went quiet. The next morning, instead of confronting Carol Finch or the construction crew, I went back to the county records office. This time, I wasn't asking questions. I was making requests. I got certified copies of everything. My original 1993 warranty deed, with a submerged land rights clause. The flawed 1988 boundary adjustment showing the incorrect coordinates, and the official parcel maps from Luis's GPS survey. I paid in cash and walked out with a thick manila folder that felt heavier than a toolbox. That folder was my ammunition. I spent the next few weeks documenting their crime. Every morning at sunrise, I'd be out with my camera, taking time-stamped photos of their progress. The concrete foundations being poured into my lakebed, the framing going up, the delivery of lumber and shingles. I filled up 3 memory cards. Luis came back with his drone. He flew it on a quiet Sunday morning, getting high-resolution aerial shots. From above, it was undeniable. 38 little cabins arranged in neat rows, all sitting squarely inside the property lines he had mapped. It was a perfect, damning picture of industrial-scale trespassing. The HOA, meanwhile, thought they had me beaten. They sent more letters. The $2,000 fine was now past due. With late fees, a new letter arrived, this one from a law firm, threatening further legal action if I was seen on the construction site again. They were threatening to sue me for trespassing on my own property. I filed it neatly in my folder behind the other evidence. One afternoon, Carol's little security guard, the one who dressed like a discount sheriff, rolled up to my fence line in his golf cart. He saw me standing on my lawn, just watching. "You're in violation of a legal notice, Mr. Mallory," he said, puffing his chest out. "This is your final warning." I didn't say a word. I just held up my phone, making sure he saw the red light of the recording app was on. He looked at the phone, then at me. His tough guy act deflated like a cheap balloon. He stammered something about it being a courtesy reminder and sped off. I saved the video. She thought I was scared. She thought I was hiding. In reality, I was just letting her build my case for me. While Carol was busy playing queen, her kingdom was starting to crumble from the inside. The constant noise was the first crack. Nail guns started at 7 a.m. The roar of generators went on all day. Heavy trucks tore up the edge of the asphalt road. The dust was everywhere, coating windows and patio furniture. Then came the parking problems, with construction vehicles blocking driveways. Litter from the crews, soda cans and sandwich wrappers started appearing in people's yards. My neighbors, the ones who had avoided my gaze, started to look miserable. Bill Hanley flagged me down one morning while I was getting the mail. He looked embarrassed. "Hey, Jack," he mumbled, looking at his shoes. This is a real mess, isn't it? Can't even fish off my dock anymore with all that racket." I just nodded. "It is, Bill." He wanted to say more. I could see it. But the fear Carol had installed was still there. He just shook his head and walked away. The community she claimed to be beautifying was becoming a noisy, dirty construction zone, and people were remembering what peace and quiet felt like. The peak of her arrogance came about a month later. It was a Saturday. They'd finished the first 10 cabins, complete with little wooden porches and shiny new numbers on the doors. Carol decided to throw a grand opening party. A big white tent went up. Caterers arrived. There was even a cameraman from the local news station. I watched from my porch as HOA members and local business owners mingled, drinking champagne from plastic flutes. Carol stood at a podium, microphone in hand, beaming. She talked about progress and community investment. She thanked her board members for their vision. I walked down to the fence that separated my property from hers, or rather, from the part of my property she was currently occupying. I just stood there, hands in my pockets, and watched. I wasn't angry. I was an observer. I was a man holding a royal flush, letting the other player bet everything they have on a pair of twos. She saw me standing there. For a moment, our eyes met across the 50 yards of trampled grass. She gave me a tight, triumphant smirk, then turned back to the camera. She thought I'd show up yelling. She thought I'd make a scene and prove I was the unstable old crank she'd painted me as. Instead, I just showed up listening. I listened to her build her pedestal a little higher, completely unaware that I was the one who was about to kick it out from under her. Even with a winning hand, a good player gives his opponent a chance to fold. It's the decent thing to do. I put all my papers in a neat stack in my folder, the 1,993 deed, Luis's survey maps, the photos, and I called the HOA office. I requested a private meeting with Carol and her board. Just them, no audience. Her assistant sounded surprised but booked it for the following Tuesday. I walked into that same stale-smelling clubhouse, but this time, the table was set for a confrontation. Carol sat at the head, flanked by her treasurer, Martha Koenig, and a couple of other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. I calmly laid out my case. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed one document after another on the table. This is the official county record of my deed, from 1993, showing my ownership of the shoreline and the submerged land. I slid it in front of her. This is a modern GPS survey confirming those boundaries. I placed it next to the deed. And these, I said, fanning out a dozen photos, are pictures of the 38 structures you have illegally built on my private property. There was a dead silence in the room. Martha, The treasurer looked pale. She kept glancing from the papers to Carol, but Carol Finch didn't even flinch. She leaned back in her chair, a smirk playing on her lips. She hadn't looked at a single document I'd put down. She just looked at me. Then she started to laugh. It was the same condescending, barking laugh I'd heard by the oak tree. "Mr. Mallory, you really are relentless, aren't you?" she said, her voice full of mock pity. "We've been over this. Your paperwork is ancient history." She tapped her own thick binder of permits. "This is what matters. The county's current records." I pressed the record button on my phone, which was sitting screen down on the table. "Your records are based on a clerical error from 1988, I said, keeping my voice level. "My survey proves it." She finally lost her smile. Her face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. She stood up, leaning her knuckles on the table. "Let me be very clear," she said, her voice low and sharp. "This board does not recognize your claim. We have the permits, we have the county's blessing, and we have the cabins. If you think you own this land, then go prove it in court. Now, this meeting is over." I walked out of that clubhouse into the bright afternoon sun, and it felt like a heavy steel door had slammed shut behind me. The finality of her words hit me harder than I expected. Go prove it in court. She knew I was a retired electrician living on a fixed income. A court battle could take years, cost tens of thousands of dollars I didn't have. It was a checkmate. I got in my truck, and as I pulled away, a strange tightness spread across my chest. It felt like a thick band being cinched around my ribs, squeezing the air out. My left arm started to tingle. I told myself it was just stress, but the fear was cold and real. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to take a deep breath, but my lungs wouldn't cooperate. This is it, I thought. This is the big one. She's not just taking my land, she's going to kill me. I managed to drive myself not to the local hospital, but to the VA clinic. It was the only place I trusted. They rushed me in, hooked me up to machines that beeped and whirred. After a few hours, the doctor came in, a man with a kind face and tired eyes. He told me it wasn't a heart attack, but a severe anxiety attack brought on by extreme stress. "Your heart is strong, Jack," he said, looking at my chart. "But stress is a slow poison. Whatever you're fighting, you can't fight it with anger. That will put you in here for real. You have to fight it with precision. Be a surgeon, not a brawler." I went home feeling defeated. The doctor's words echoed in my head, but all I could feel was the weight of Carol's challenge. Court. I sat on my porch for hours, staring at the half-built cabins that blighted my view, thinking about selling. Just pack it all up, leave Sarah's tree, leave the lake, and find somewhere quiet where a clipboard bully couldn't reach me. The thought made me feel sick. That evening, Louis stopped by. He saw the look on my face. "What'd she say, Jack?" I told him everything. The meeting, the court challenge, the trip to the VA. "Maybe I should just sell," I finished, the words tasting like ash. Just let her have it. Luis was quiet for a long time. Then he looked from me to the oak tree, then back again. "Jack," he said, his voice firm, "they're not just building on your land. They built on your wife's lake, brother. They tore up the ground she rests in. That's not just land. You can't sell that." He was right. Selling wasn't an escape. It was a surrender. It meant letting her win. It meant letting her desecrate Sarah's memory for profit. The doctor's words came back to me. Fight it with precision. What was the most precise move? A lawsuit was a mess, a brawl, but there had to be another way. And then it hit me. I wasn't suing her. I wasn't disputing a contract. I was stating a fact. The fact was, I owned the land. I didn't need a court to prove it. I just needed the county to confirm it. The next morning, I didn't call a lawyer. I went back to the county records office and filed a simple 2-page document. A land, titled confirmation request. It wasn't an attack. It was a question. It formally asked the recorder's office to review all associated deeds for my parcel and issue a binding confirmation of the legal property lines. I attached a certified copy of the 993 deed and Luis's GPS survey. When word got back to the HOA, they laughed. One of the board members told Bill Hanley it was a joke, a desperate move. That'll get buried in paperwork for months, maybe years, he'd scoffed. Carol and her cronies were sure they'd won. They knew how slow the system was, but they didn't know one thing. They didn't know that the county clerk, the woman whose desk my request would land on, the one person with the authority to expedite it, was my late wife Sarah's cousin, and she had always hated bullies. I didn't hear anything for 3 weeks. The construction continued, louder and faster than ever, as if Carol were trying to outrun the truth. They started pouring foundations for the next batch of cabins, even closer to the old oak tree. Every clang of a hammer felt like a tick of a clock, and I started to wonder if I'd made the wrong bet. I told myself to trust the process, to trust Sarah's cousin Eleanor to be as thorough and fair as she'd always been. But doubt is a weed. It grows in silence. Then, on a Wednesday morning, the quiet broke. It started with a single mail truck. It wasn't the regular mail carrier. It was a special courier. He had 4 identical certified letters, each one requiring a signature. One for Carol Finch at her home address, one for Martha Koenig, the treasurer, and one for each of the other 2 board members. My own letter had arrived the day before. It was a single, beautiful page of official county letterhead. It was a formal, legally binding title confirmation. It stated, in the clear, unambiguous language of the law, that my 1,993 warranty deed was the primary and active deed of record. It confirmed my ownership of the entire Mallory shoreline, including all submerged land as described. The final sentence was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. All other claims or adjustments conflicting with this primary deed are hereby deemed subordinate and invalid. The paper in my hand wasn't just a confirmation, it was a bomb. And those certified letters were the fuses. The gossip started about an hour later. My neighbor across the street, who was friends with one of the board members' wives, called me. "Jack, what in the world did you do?" she whispered into the phone. "Frank got some letter from the county, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost. He and his wife are in a shouting match on their front lawn. By noon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. I saw Carol storm out of her house, get into her oversized SUV, and peel out of her driveway, spraying gravel. She went straight to the county records office. I can only imagine the conversation she had with Eleanor. I picture her waving her binder of permits, demanding answers, her voice getting higher and shriller as the calm, steady truth of the situation settled on her. I imagine Eleanor just pointing to the text of the primary deed, to the map, to the law. There's no arguing with a recorded fact. She returned an hour later, driving much, much slower. Her perfect composure was gone. For the first time, I saw a crack in the Queen's armor. She tried to spin it, of course. An emergency email went out to all Lakeside Meadows residents. It claimed there was a minor clerical error at the county office, a temporary misunderstanding that her lawyers were aggressively resolving. But the panic was already setting in. People had paid thousands of dollars in special lake access fees to the HOA as part of the beautification project. If the HOA didn't own the lake access, where did their money go? That's when I made my next move. Precision, the doctor had said, not anger. I didn't shout, I didn't gloat, I acted. I'd spent the last week setting up a simple LLC, Mallory Holdings. It sounded official, solid. That afternoon, Luis and I went to a print shop. We had large, professional-looking signs made. Then we started posting them. The first one went up right next to the HOA's private property sign at the main entrance. My sign was bigger. It read, "This shoreline and all structures thereon are the private property of Mallory Holdings, LLC. All unauthorized persons are trespassing." We put another one up at the new gravel road leading down to the cabins, and for each of the 38 cabins, finished or not, I posted a bright red notice of trespass directly onto the front door. I also mailed them. Every board member and the HOA's management company received a registered letter from Mallory Holdings, LLC. It was a formal invoice. It billed them for unauthorized occupation and use of private land, calculated at a very reasonable market rate per square foot, per day, retroactive to the start of construction. The bill was already well into six figures. The community didn't just buzz anymore. It exploded. My phone rang off the hook. Neighbors who had shunned me for months were suddenly calling to ask what was happening. Bill Hanley showed up on my porch, hat in his hands, apologizing. "I should have backed you from the start, Jack," he said. "We all should have. She's a bully." I just told him, "It's not over yet, Bill." The final blow came late that afternoon. I got a call from Sheriff Tom Leland. He's a good man, known him for years from the VFW. "Jack," he said, his voice tired but firm, "I've got your title confirmation here, and I've got a very frantic Carol Finch on my other line screaming about harassment. I've read through the paperwork. Looks pretty clear-cut to me." He paused. "I'm calling Miss Finch back to give her a courtesy advisory. I'm going to have to inform her that she and her contractors may be operating on private property without the owner's permission, and that any further work is being done at their own legal and financial risk. I'm going to advise them to vacate the property until this is fully resolved in a civil court." I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. This wasn't just a win. This was the system, the real system, grinding the fake system to a halt. The queen had been checked. Now, it was time to topple the throne. The HOA called an emergency meeting for that Friday night. The email declared its purpose was to address the baseless claims of a disruptive resident. Baseless. After a legally binding confirmation from the county and an official advisory from the sheriff's office, she was still calling my claim baseless. The arrogance was breathtaking. But this time, it wasn't just me she had to convince. The whole community was on edge. When I walked into the clubhouse that night, it wasn't the half-empty room of defeated neighbors I remembered. It was packed. People were standing along the walls. Bill Hanley gave me a firm nod as I entered. I even saw a young woman I recognized from the local news website, phone up, live streaming the whole thing. The fear in the room had curdled into anger, and it was pointed directly at the front table where Carol and her board sat. Carol tried to start the meeting with her usual brand of smiling authority, rapping a gavel on the table. "All right, let's settle down," she began, her voice a little too bright. "I know there's been a lot of misinformation circulating, but I want to assure you all that your board has this situation completely under control." She launched into her speech, calling the title confirmation a bureaucratic snafu and me a serial troublemaker. She belittled me. She belittled the county clerk. She belittled the very idea that her grand vision could be flawed. "He's bluffing," she said, looking right at me with those cold, dead eyes. "No court in this state will ever honor that dusty old piece of paper he's waving around." The room was rumbling with discontent. People were whispering, shuffling their feet. This wasn't a community meeting. It was a powder keg, and she was tapping it with a hammer. When she finally finished her tirade, a heavy silence fell. Every eye in the room turned to me. I stood up, holding the same manila folder I'd brought to our private meeting. I walked, slowly, to the front table. I didn't say a word. I just looked at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I took one single document from my folder and slid it across the table so it stopped right in front of her. "You said no court would honor it," I said, my voice quiet but carrying through the still room. "But one already has." On the paper was not the deed itself, but the county's official, legally binding title confirmation, complete with the recorder's embossed seal and signature. For the folks in the back who couldn't see, I'd thought ahead. I nodded to Luis, who was standing by a small projector. He hit a button, and a perfect, clear image of the document flashed up on the big screen behind Carol's head. A collective gasp went through the room. There it was, undeniable, stamped in official ink, subordinate and invalid. The words hung in the air, above her perfectly styled hair. For the first time, Carol Finch had absolutely nothing to say. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her entire empire of lies, built on a foundation of fake paperwork and intimidation, had just been demolished by a single, verifiable fact. And then the room turned. It was like a dam breaking. A man in the back stood up. "I paid a $3,000 lake access fee," he shouted. "Was that just theft, Carol?" A woman near the front jumped to her feet. "What about our property values? You built an illegal hotel next to our homes." The questions came like a flood, one after another, each one more furious than the last. "Fraud. We want our money back. Resign." Martha Koenig, the treasurer, had shrunk down in her chair, looking like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. She was whispering to herself, "I told her not to build. I told her." But Carol, cornered and exposed, did the only thing a bully knows how to do. She attacked. "This is his fault," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "He is trying to destroy this community. It was just a clerical error." But nobody was listening to her anymore. A retired police officer I knew, a big guy named Henderson, stood up. He wasn't shouting. His voice was calm, and that made it all the more powerful. "Carol," he said, and the whole room went quiet to listen. "You didn't just make a clerical error. You forged permit applications using a fraudulent deed. You took our money under false pretenses. That's a crime. I'm demanding your immediate resignation." Just as he finished, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open. Sheriff Tom Leland stepped inside, two of his deputies behind him. He wasn't there for crowd control. He was holding a piece of paper. He walked to the front table, ignoring the chaos, and looked directly at Carol. "Carol Finch," he said, his voice ringing with real authority. "I am serving you with this official cease and desist order. All construction is to halt immediately. All rental activities are suspended. This entire site is now considered a potential scene in an active fraud investigation." The public humiliation was total. It was happening live, on camera, in front of the very people she had ruled with an iron fist. Her face, a mask of rage and disbelief, was projected onto the screen behind her. As the deputies escorted her out of the room, she was still screeching about lawyers and clerical errors. But for the first time in years, the room wasn't afraid of her voice. They were listening to mine. After the storm of that meeting, the silence that followed was heavy and final. Carol Finch's downfall wasn't a slow slide. It was a straight drop off a cliff. Once the sheriff's department started looking into the HOA's books, the whole house of cards came down. Her treasurer, Martha Koenig, folded in the first hour of questioning. Turns out, Carol hadn't just used a faulty deed. She'd been skimming money from the beautification fund for years, forging payment authorizations and contractor invoices. Martha knew all of it. Faced with felony charges of her own, she gave up everything and everyone. Carol was charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a mess in her mugshot. Her kingdom of clipboards and condescension had dissolved into a mess of legal fees and public disgrace. The HOA itself was effectively dismantled, the board resigning in shame, and the management company dropping them like a hot rock. They had built an empire, and it vanished overnight. Now, I was left with the spoils of a war I never wanted to fight. 38 cabins, in various states of completion, sitting on my land, legally, through Mallory Holdings, LLC. I owned every nail, every 2x4. The contractors, who hadn't been fully paid by the fraudulent HOA, placed liens on the structures. My first, most practical thought was to settle the liens, get the structures torn down, and sell the lumber for scrap. Just erase the whole ugly chapter and get my Shoreline back. For a few days, that was the plan. I walked through the quiet, half-finished cabins. They were an eyesore, a monument to greed. But then, standing on the porch of Cabin Hashon, the one closest to the oak tree, I looked out at the lake. The view, from that slight elevation, was breathtaking. The morning sun was hitting the water, and the whole world felt still. And I remembered something Sarah used to say whenever we'd sit on the porch together. She'd sigh and say, "This lake, Jack, it's a healing place. I wish we could share this peace with people who really need it." She'd always had a soft spot for veterans coming home, for people who carried invisible wounds. And in that moment, looking at that view, a new plan began to form, a better one. I didn't tear the cabins down. I finished them. I used my own savings to pay off the contractors' liens. They were honest workers who'd been tricked just like everyone else. I hired a few of them to stay on. Luis helped me draw up new, simpler plans. We didn't make them fancy rental units. We made them simple, quiet, comfortable. We built wheelchair ramps on a few, widened the doorways. The news of what I was doing spread quietly through the town, then through the VFW and the local VA. Other vets started showing up on Saturdays, guys I hadn't seen in years. Electricians, plumbers, carpenters. They didn't ask for pay. They just came to help. We were a team again, a unit with a mission. It wasn't about building cabins anymore. It was about reclaiming something. The community started to heal too. The neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me started stopping by with coffee and donuts. For the work crews, Bill Hanley, my old friend, showed up one Saturday with a shovel and a bag of topsoil. He didn't say much. He just went straight to the old oak tree and started carefully repairing the scarred ground around its roots where the bulldozer had torn it up. It was his way of apologizing, and it was more than enough. The fear Carol had sown was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of solidarity. We weren't an HOA with rules and fines. We were just neighbors, fixing what was broken. A few months later, the work was done. We named the place Sarah's Landing. It's not a resort. It's a retreat. A place for veterans and their families to come for a week, free of charge, to find a little bit of the peace that Sarah and I had cherished. My LLC became a nonprofit foundation to keep it running. The same neighbors who had once feared fines now volunteer to help clean the cabins between visitors and maintain the shoreline. They're proud of it. We all are. This evening, I took my coffee down to the dock. The wood is new, repaired from the construction damage. The evening is calm. A folded American flag, the one from my father's military funeral, sits on the bench beside me. The sun is setting over Mallory Lake, painting the water in shades of orange and purple. The 38 cabins are dark, their lights off, nestled quietly in the trees. They're not an eyesore anymore. They're a legacy. I look out at the still water, at the reflection of the old oak tree on the surface. Justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just settles like still water after the storm's done its work.